Hi everyone, my name is Axel Antoine. I am an engineer in the Loki research group at INRIA in Lille. I represent you our taxonomy used to identify illustration strategies and techniques for visually representing interaction scenarios. This project was done during my PhD with Sylvain Malacria and Géry Casiez and in collaboration with Marquardt from the University College London. An interactive scenario is a complex situation in which one or more users interact with one or more interactive systems. The best way to fully understand an interactive scenario is, of course, to experience it, for example, during a demo session in a conference, or at least to see it in action, like here in videos. Yet, the main material used for communicating new systems are papers with static illustration of interaction scenarios. This project aims to understand what illustration strategies are used to depict such interaction scenarios. To answer this question, we created a dataset of figures that we extracted from SIGCHI papers and patents. We coded the dataset to analyze relationships between codes and figures to extract illustration strategies. And we built a taxonomy of the design elements used in illustrations. To build the taxonomy, we first applied a grounded theory approach. Each coder coded a subset of images with codes answering to one of the following questions. What is represented and how is it represented? The concept consisted in improving the taxonomy. To do that, we iteratively discussed, modified the current state of the taxonomy, coded a new sample of figures, and computed an agreement score. Finally, after 4 iterations to improve the taxonomy, we coded the dataset. That is, coding the remaining figures of the dataset and recoding the figures used in previous steps. Some taxonomies already exist, but are limited to specific context of interaction or use case that you can see here. To these existing codes, we also added new ones identified during the coding process, giving the total of 118 codes for our unified taxonomy. We have 2 categories of codes, blue for what codes and red for how codes, that we also regrouped in 6 families. Interactive system, that describes the composition of a system. Users, that describes the user's situation. Interactive scenario, that gives the system context. Composition, that describes how it structures a figure. Visual characteristics, that visually describes the figure. And visual techniques, that describes techniques used to depict some visual aspects of the figure. We then extracted the illustration strategies using an exploratory approach. To do that, we created a new tool, the Taxonomy Explorer, that allows to select and deselect codes to observe the impact on the resulting figures. By grouping codes on the number of occurrences, it is then possible to extract strategies used to illustrate specific interactive scenarios. We identified 3 groups of strategies: structural strategies, interaction strategies, and pattern strategies. Structural strategies are strategies used to build a figure, such as choosing a frame structure, choosing a point of view, subframing, for example, using picture-in-picture or frame blending, relationships between elements, and preprocessing photographs. Interaction strategies are strategies used to represent specific interaction contexts, such as defining the interactive space, highlighting interactive elements, for example, using colors, representing frame dynamic, for example, using a stroboscopic effect, highlighting users' actions, for example, using touch contact points, and illustrating non-visual feedback. Finally, pattern strategies are strategies that follow the official guidelines on patent illustration, but also use structural and interaction strategies. Please refer to the paper for details for each strategy identified. To sum up, we presented in this paper a coding process of figures extracted from SIGCHI papers and patents, a taxonomy that covers a large spectrum of interaction scenarios in SIGCHI, 11 families of illustration strategies that can be used as guidelines to help researchers to create new figures, 3 online tools already available to ease the coding process, visualize the taxonomy, and explore and identify new illustration strategies of interactive scenarios.